They thought a piece of paper could erase 23 years of blood. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. Heavy cream stock, embossed with the law firm's seal, addressed to Captain Sarah Mitchell in crisp, black lettering. The return address made my stomach drop. Whitman, Chase & Associates, Estate Division. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I knew what it meant before I broke the wax seal. My mother had been sick for 8 months. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't negotiate. The kind that gives you just enough time to settle scores and rewrite history. Apparently, she'd used every minute. The apartment in Colorado Springs was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of jets from Peterson Air Force Base. Home for exactly 4 days between deployments, and already the walls felt too close, too civilian. I'd gotten used to the vast emptiness of forward operating bases, where every sound had meaning and silence could save your life. My hands shook as I unfolded the legal document, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The will was thorough, clinical in its cruelty. 3 pages of whereas and heretofore, all building to the same conclusion. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, daughter, was to receive nothing. Not the house in Denver where I'd grown up. Not the antique furniture my grandmother had left behind. Not even the family photos that proved I'd once existed in their perfect suburban world. Instead, everything went to my younger brother Marcus. The golden child who'd married his college sweetheart, bought a house 6 blocks from our parents, and produced 2 grandchildren with regulation blue eyes and careful smiles. Marcus, who'd never missed a Sunday dinner or questioned a family decision. Marcus, who'd stood by silently while they slowly erased me from every conversation, every holiday card, every future they'd planned. The reasoning was spelled out in brutal legalese, due to choices that have brought shame to the family name and values incompatible with our legacy, choices. As if serving my country had been a whim. As if dedicating my life to something bigger than their suburban comfort had been a teenage rebellion I'd never outgrown. I set the document down and walked to the window. Outside, the Rockies stretched endlessly, their peaks catching the last light of day. Somewhere out there, past the mountains and plains, was the family that had decided I no longer existed. The family that had held a funeral for their daughter before she was dead. The worst part wasn't the money. I'd learned to live on military pay, learned to find value in things that couldn't be bought or inherited. The worst part was the signature at the bottom. Witnessed by Marcus and his wife Jennifer, dated just 2 weeks ago. They'd all been there, sitting around the mahogany dining table where I'd once blown out birthday candles, watching our mothers sign away any proof that I'd ever mattered. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop. Text message from an unknown Denver number. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I know you got the papers. Call me. We need to talk." I stared at the screen until it went dark, then deleted the message without responding. Some conversations were 20 years too late. I'd known this moment was coming since the day I enlisted. The recruitment office had been my escape route from a life that felt too small, too predictable. While my classmates planned sororities and spring breaks, I'd been planning a future that didn't require their approval. The Army had given me purpose, structure, and most importantly, distance from people who loved me only when I was convenient. But I hadn't expected it to hurt this much. Disinheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was about being formally erased from a story you'd helped write. It was about watching the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally choose instead to love you never. The evening light shifted, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I picked up the legal papers again, reading them more carefully this time. Something nagged at me, a detail that didn't quite fit. The will mentioned all assets and properties currently held in the estate of Margaret Louise Mitchell. Currently held. Legal language was precise, and that phrase suggested there might be assets not currently held in her estate. My grandfather had died when I was 12, too young to understand estate planning or trust funds. But I remembered the hushed conversations between my parents after the funeral, the way they'd spoken about complications and lawyers in Washington. I remembered my father saying something about military benefits being handled separately, and my mother's tight-lipped response that they'd deal with it later. Later had apparently never come. I opened my laptop and started typing. Military death benefits, veteran trust funds, inheritance laws for active duty personnel. The search results painted a complex picture of regulations I'd never needed to understand. Most military members had simple wills, straightforward beneficiaries. But my grandfather hadn't been most military. Colonel James Mitchell had served in Korea, Vietnam, and the First Gulf War. 32 years of active duty, multiple decorations, and, from what I remembered, a pension that had kept him comfortable until the day he died. But more than that, he'd been connected. The kind of officer who knew senators and appeared in Pentagon meetings. The kind whose funeral had been attended by men in expensive suits who spoke in careful whispers. I'd always assumed his money had gone to my parents, filtered down through the normal channels of inheritance. But what if it hadn't? What if there had been provisions, conditions, trusts that my parents had hoped would simply fade away with time? The thought felt dangerous, like hoping for something I couldn't afford to want, but it also felt possible. My grandfather had been the one person in my family who'd never questioned my decision to enlist. He'd been the one who'd pulled strings to get me into West Point, who'd written recommendation letters in his careful script, who'd told me that service was the highest calling Mitchell could answer. He'd also been the one who'd argued with my parents the night before I left for basic training. I'd heard them through the thin walls of our house, voices raised in anger. My grandfather's deep baritone cutting through my mother's shrill protests. "She's following in my footsteps, Margaret. You should be proud." My mother's response had been ice cold. "Your footsteps led to broken families and absent fathers. I won't watch her make the same mistakes." They'd thought he was filling my head with romantic notions about duty and honor. They'd thought he was stealing their daughter away from the life they'd planned for me. Maybe he had been. Maybe that had been exactly his intention. I closed the laptop and walked back to the window. The mountains had disappeared into darkness, but I could feel them out there, solid and unmovable. Like the truth I was starting to uncover. Tomorrow, I'll make some phone calls. I'd dig into records and regulations, trust documents, and military protocols. I'd find out if my grandfather had left me something more valuable than money. He'd left me a choice. The first crack appeared when I was 17, standing in the guidance counselor's office with college brochures scattered across her desk like promises I wasn't allowed to keep. Mrs. Henderson had called my parents in for what she termed an important discussion about Sarah's future. Translation: their daughter was about to derail the family plan. West Point? My mother's voice could have cut glass. Absolutely not. She sat rigid in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her purse clutched against her chest like armor. My father said nothing, just stared at the motivational posters on the wall as if they might offer him an escape route. The silence stretched until Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Sarah has exceptional leadership qualities," she began carefully. "Her grades, her athletics, her community service record. The academy specifically recruits students like her." "Students like her?" My mother's laugh was bitter. "You mean students who want to throw their lives away?" I'd been standing by the window, watching the football team practice on the field below. At 17, I already knew I was different from the other girls in my class. While they planned spring formal dresses and college sororities, I dreamed of something bigger, something that mattered. The Army recruiter had visited our school the month before, and his words had hit me like lightning. Some people are called to serve something greater than themselves. "Mom," I said, turning from the window, "this is what I want." "What do you want?" She stood abruptly, her voice rising. "You're 17 years old. You don't know what you want. You know what your grandfather has been filling your head with." That was the heart of it. My grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell, had been my hero since childhood. Every summer, I'd spend weeks at his house in Arlington, listening to stories that made my parents uncomfortable. Stories about duty, sacrifice, and the weight of protecting something bigger than your own comfort. While other kids played with dolls, I'd been learning about military history, studying maps of places I couldn't pronounce but desperately wanted to see. "James is filling her head with nonsense," my mother continued, her composure cracking. "All this talk about honor and service, it's not the 1950s anymore. Women have real opportunities now." "The military is a real opportunity," I shot back. My father finally spoke, his voice tired. Sarah, your mother and I have sacrificed everything to give you choices. Good choices. You could go to Colorado University, study business, meet someone stable, build a normal life. Normal. The word hung in the air like a judgment. Normal meant staying within a 50-mile radius of home. Normal meant marrying someone from our social circle, someone who played golf at the country club and never questioned why things were the way they were. Normal meant becoming a smaller version of my mother, polished and proper and quietly dying inside. I don't want normal, I said. The fight that followed wasn't loud. My family didn't do it out loud. We did cold disappointment and strategic silence. Mrs. Henderson tried to mediate, explaining the benefits of military service, the leadership training, the career opportunities. My parents sat stone-faced through her presentation, already planning their counterattack. It came 3 days later. I found my grandfather's letters missing from my desk drawer. The college brochures he'd sent, the application materials, the personal recommendation he'd written in his careful handwriting. All gone. When I confronted my mother, she was arranging flowers in the kitchen, each stem precisely placed. I threw them away, she said without looking up, along with the other inappropriate materials he's been sending you. Those were mine. You're 17. Nothing is yours until you're old enough to make responsible decisions. That's when I learned the difference between power and control. My parents had control over my mail, my activities, my immediate future, but they couldn't control who I was becoming. That night, I called my grandfather from the phone in the garage, speaking in whispers while my parents watched television in the living room. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. They took the letters, I told him. His sigh was heavy, familiar. I figured they might. Your mother called me yesterday, told me to stop interfering. Are you going to? A long pause. Then, Sarah, I've spent 60 years learning that some battles are worth fighting, even when you're outnumbered. Especially then. The next few months became a war of attrition. My parents scheduled college visits to schools I hadn't applied to. They arranged meetings with family friends who could offer internships in appropriate fields. They spoke about my future in past tense, as if my decisions had already been made by committee. Meanwhile, my grandfather worked behind the scenes. He couldn't openly defy my parents without destroying their relationship entirely. But he could send information through friends, through contacts, through channels they couldn't monitor. I learned about ROTC programs, military academies, scholarship opportunities. I learned that there were paths they couldn't block, as long as I was willing to walk them alone. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner my senior year. The extended family had gathered, aunts and uncles and cousins filling the dining room with the kind of forced cheer that felt like a performance. My cousin Jessica was announcing her engagement to a banker from Boulder. My cousin David was starting law school in the spring. Everyone had appropriate, parent-approved futures. When my uncle asked about my college plans, my mother answered for me. Sarah's been accepted to several excellent schools. We're still deciding which opportunity would be best. The lie sat heavy in the room. I hadn't been accepted anywhere because I hadn't applied anywhere, not to their schools. My applications had gone to West Point, the Air Force Academy, and 3 ROTC programs at universities they'd never heard of. My grandfather caught my eye across the table and gave the slightest nod. Actually, I said, setting down my fork, I've been accepted to West Point. The silence that followed wasn't surprise. It was horror. My mother's face went white, then red. My father gripped his napkin like it might anchor him to reality. Marcus, who was 14 and still thought I walked on water, grinned until he saw our parents' expressions. That's impossible, my mother said finally. You never applied. I reached into my purse and pulled out the acceptance letter I'd been carrying for 2 weeks. The official seal, the congratulations, the instructions for reporting to Beast Barracks the following summer. I'd memorized every word. I did apply. With Grandpa's help. That's when she turned to him, her voice shaking with rage. How could you do this to us? She's our daughter. My grandfather straightened in his chair, every inch the colonel he'd once been. She's also her own person, Margaret, something you seem to have forgotten. The argument that exploded then shattered something in our family that never quite healed. Accusations flew across the table like artillery. My mother accused my grandfather of stealing her daughter. He accused her of trying to clip my wings. My father tried to play peacemaker but ended up satisfying no one. Through it all, Marcus watched with wide eyes, learning lessons about loyalty and courage that our parents never intended to teach. Later, he'd tell me it was the first time he'd seen anyone stand up to our mother's vision of how our lives should unfold. The worst part came after the guests left. My parents sat me down in the living room, their faces set in identical expressions of disappointed determination. They'd talked, they said. They'd decided. If I insisted on this military nonsense, I'd be doing it alone. No financial support, no family visits, no place at the family table when I came home on leave. Choose carefully, Sarah, my mother said. Some decisions can't be undone. I looked at them sitting there on the couch they'd bought to match the curtains, in the house they'd furnished to impress the neighbors, and I realized I'd already chosen. I'd chosen the moment I first heard my grandfather's stories about serving something greater than yourself. I'd chosen when I'd felt the pull of a purpose bigger than their comfortable, predictable world. I understand, I said. And I did. I understood that love, for them, was conditional. That family meant conformity. That their vision of my happiness required the death of everything that made me who I was. 2 weeks later, my grandfather slipped me an envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a note in his careful handwriting. For the strong-willed Mitchell, who reminds me why I served. Use this to build the life you choose, not the one they choose for you. It was the last gift he'd ever give me. 3 months after I left for West Point, he suffered a massive heart attack. I came home for the funeral in my cadet uniform, standing at attention while they buried the only person who'd ever understood me. My parents didn't save me a seat in the front row. West Point broke me down to bare bones in the first 6 weeks, then rebuilt me into something my family wouldn't recognize. The girl who'd argued with her parents over college applications disappeared somewhere between the endless gray stone corridors and the brutal precision of morning formations. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, forged by discipline and purpose. Beast Barracks was designed to strip away everything you thought you were. No makeup, no personal items, no contact with the outside world that might remind you of the softer version of yourself. Just the relentless rhythm of revie, inspection, drill, study, sleep, repeat until you either broke or became unbreakable. I chose unbreakable. The other cadets came from military families mostly, third-generation officers, with fathers who'd attended the academy and mothers who understood the language of duty. They had built-in support systems, networks of people who'd walked this path before. I had letters from my grandfather that I read until the paper wore thin, and a $10,000 check that meant more than money. It meant someone believed in me. My roommate, Jessica Chen, was the daughter of a Navy admiral. She had perfect posture and spoke in clipped sentences that sounded like orders even when she was asking about the weather. On our third night, she found me crying quietly into my pillow after receiving the first letter from home. Not from my parents. From Marcus. "They're pretending you don't exist," he'd written in his careful 16-year-old handwriting. "Mom removed all your pictures from the mantle. Dad converted your room into his office. They told people at church you're finding yourself somewhere. I hate them for it." Jessica read the letter without asking permission, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "Family can be the enemy too," she said simply. "The difference is, here you get to choose your family." She was right. Over the next 4 years, I built a family from people who understood sacrifice, who valued loyalty earned rather than loyalty assumed. There was Captain Rodriguez, who taught military history and treated every lesson like it mattered beyond the classroom. Sergeant Major Williams, who'd served 3 tours in Iraq and could read character in a handshake. My classmates who became battle-tested friends. People who'd trust you with their lives because they knew you'd never betray that trust. The academic load was crushing. Engineering courses, military science, leadership theory, foreign languages. While my high school friends were pledging sororities and choosing majors that sounded impressive at cocktail parties, I was learning how to read topographical maps in the dark, and calculate artillery trajectories under pressure. Every skill had life or death applications. Every grade mattered because lives would eventually depend on your competence. But it was the leadership training that truly transformed me. They put you in impossible situations and watched how you responded. Mock battles where half your squad was wounded, and you had to complete the mission anyway. Ethical dilemmas where every choice carried consequences. Moments when you had to choose between what was easy and what was right, knowing that choosing right might cost you everything. I excelled at the difficult choices, maybe because I had been making them since I was 17. By sophomore year, I'd earned respect that had nothing to do with my last name or my family's approval. I was squad leader, then company commander. Other cadets sought my advice, trusted my judgment. For the first time in my life, I was valued for who I was becoming, not who I'd been born to be. The recognition came with responsibilities. I tutored struggling freshmen, led weekend training exercises, represented the academy at recruitment events. I learned that leadership wasn't about commanding respect, but earning it. That authority came not from rank, but from competence and character. That the best officers were those who served their soldiers, not the other way around. My junior year, Colonel Matthews called me into his office. He was the head of the military psychology department, the kind of officer who could read people like tactical manuals. His office was sparse, decorated only with a flag and a single photo of soldiers I didn't recognize. "Mitchell," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been watching your development." I sat at attention, unsure whether this was praise or criticism. "Sir, you have something most cadets lack, an understanding of what it means to be alone, to make hard choices without a safety net." He leaned back in his chair. "Most of these kids have families who'll catch them if they fall. You've learned to catch yourself." He was right. While other cadets called home for comfort during difficult periods, I'd learned to find strength internally. When homesickness hit, I channeled it into determination. When doubt crept in, I used it to fuel harder training. I'd become self-sufficient in ways that my classmates couldn't understand. "I'm recommending you for the advanced leadership track," he continued. "Accelerated promotion opportunities. Specialized training. It means more responsibility, more pressure. Interested?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Because the Army needs officers who understand that sometimes you have to choose between your family and your country. And that choice defines who you are." The advanced track meant summer training at Fort Bragg with active duty Special Forces units. While my classmates went home for vacation, I learned counterinsurgency tactics from sergeants who'd fought in Afghanistan. I trained with weapon systems most officers never touched, learned languages most people never heard. I became fluent in Arabic, conversational in Pashto, and deadly accurate with every rifle in the Army inventory. More importantly, I learned to lead soldiers who'd seen combat, who'd lost friends, who treated war like a craft that demanded perfection. They didn't care about my family drama, or my gender, or my age. They cared whether I could make decisions under fire, and whether those decisions would keep them alive. Lieutenant Colonel Harris ran the program with the intensity of someone who'd buried too many soldiers. He was brutal in his assessments, unforgiving in his standards. After a particularly difficult field exercise, he pulled me aside. "You've got the instincts," he said, "but you're holding something back. Some part of yourself you're protecting." He was right. Despite all the training, all the transformation, there was still a piece of me that hoped for reconciliation. That imagined coming home in uniform to parents who'd finally understand what I'd become. That dreamed of a moment when my family would see my achievements and realize they'd been wrong. "Let it go," Harris said quietly. "Whatever you're holding on to from before, it's making you hesitate. Hesitation kills soldiers." That night, I called home for the first time in 2 years. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice cautious when she heard mine. "Sarah, is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mom. I just wanted to let you know I'll be graduating with honors. I've been selected for advanced infantry training." A pause. Then, "That's nice, dear. Marcus is starting college in the fall, Colorado State. He's going to study business." She didn't ask about my achievements, my plans, my future. She redirected the conversation to Marcus. to safe territory, to the child who'd chosen the path she understood. When I hung up, I felt something inside me finally break free. Not break apart, but break free. The last chain connecting me to their approval. I graduated third in my class, commissioned as a second lieutenant, with a specialty in intelligence operations. My grandfather's flag was presented to me by the academy superintendent, a tradition for cadets whose military family members had passed away during their education. I accepted it with pride, knowing he would have been there if he could. My parents didn't attend graduation. They sent a card with a generic congratulations message and a check for $50. Marcus came, though, driving down from Denver in his beat-up Honda, wearing the only suit he owned. He cried during the ceremony, taking pictures with a disposable camera he'd bought at a gas station. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, as we hugged afterward. "Grandpa would be too." "I know," I said, and I did know. Not because anyone had told me, but because I'd become someone worthy of that pride. My first assignment was Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne. From there, the Army would send me wherever the mission required. Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, or any place where American interests needed protecting by people willing to risk everything for something bigger than themselves. I was ready. More than ready. I was forged, tested, and proven. Whatever battles lay ahead, I'd face them with the strength I'd built from my family's rejection. They'd meant to weaken me by cutting me loose. Instead, they'd forced me to become someone who didn't need their approval to know her worth. The girl who'd begged for acceptance was gone. In her place stood an officer who'd earned respect the hard way and would never again confuse love with control. The call came at 0400 hours while I was reviewing intelligence reports in my quarters at Bagram Air Base. 12 months into my second deployment in Afghanistan, and I'd learned to sleep through mortar fire but still jolted awake at the sound of my secure phone. Emergency calls at that hour usually meant casualties, mission changes, or news that would reshape everything you thought you knew about your life. "Captain Mitchell? This is Colonel Thompson, Casualty Notification Officer at Fort Carson." My blood went cold. Casualty notification officers only called about family members. The only family member who'd ever listed me as next of kin was Marcus, and he was safe in Denver, working his first job out of college. "Sir?" "Ma'am, I'm calling to inform you that your mother, Margaret Louise Mitchell, passed away yesterday evening at Denver Presbyterian Hospital. I'm authorized to approve emergency leave for you to attend funeral arrangements." The words hit like a flashbang grenade, sudden, disorienting, leaving me temporarily unable to process sound or meaning. My mother was dead. The woman who'd spent years trying to erase me had been erased herself, and somehow the Army knew to call me. "Captain, are you there?" "Yes, sir." "How? Who listed me as notification contact?" A pause. Paper rustling. "According to our records, you're listed as next of kin by Marcus J. Mitchell. He requested we contact you immediately." Marcus. My little brother had grown up while I was learning to be a soldier. Apparently, he'd also grown a spine. The flight from Afghanistan to Denver took 36 hours, with stops in Kuwait, Germany, and Chicago. Each layover gave me time to process what I was walking into. I hadn't been home in 6 years. Hadn't spoken to my parents in 4. The last conversation had been brief, cold, a duty call to inform them I was deploying to a combat zone. My mother's response had been to ask when I planned to settle down and find a real career. Now she was gone, and I was flying home in dress blues to a funeral I wasn't sure I was invited to attend. Marcus met me at Denver International Airport, and I almost didn't recognize him. The gangly teenager I'd left behind had become a man, broader in the shoulders, steadier in his movements. But his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "Sarah." He hugged me without hesitation, holding on longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming." "How are you holding up?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Honestly, I'm furious. At cancer, at her, at the whole situation." He grabbed my duffel bag. "Come on, we need to talk before you see Dad." The drive through Denver revealed a city that had grown while I was away. New buildings, expanded highways, neighborhoods that hadn't existed when I was in high school. But the mountains remained unchanged, solid and eternal against the western horizon. "She fought it for 8 months, Marcus said, navigating traffic with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to drive in military housing. pancreatic cancer. By the time they caught it, there wasn't much they could do. Were you with her? Every day. Jennifer and I moved in 6 months ago to help Dad with the care. He glanced at me. She asked about you near the end, wanted to know if you were safe, if you were happy. But she never called. No, she never called. His voice carried years of frustration. Dad wanted to reach out when you deployed. I could see it in his face every time Afghanistan came on the news. But she wouldn't let him, said you'd made your choice and had to live with the consequences. The family house looked smaller than I remembered, the lawn less perfect. The white picket fence needed paint, and the garden my mother had tended with obsessive care showed signs of neglect. A black wreath hung on the front door, and cars I didn't recognize filled the driveway. Family's already here, Marcus warned. Aunt Patricia, Uncle David, the cousins. They've been planning the funeral for 3 days. Without consulting me. They didn't know if you'd come. Hell, I wasn't sure if you'd come. He parked on the street, leaving the driveway to the relatives who'd stayed close, who'd earned their place in the family hierarchy through proximity and compliance. Inside, the house smelled of casseroles and cut flowers. The living room buzzed with conversation that stopped the moment I walked through the door. Faces turned toward me, some familiar, some aged beyond recognition. The silence stretched until my Aunt Patricia stood from the couch. Sarah. Her voice was carefully neutral. We weren't sure you'd be able to get leave. Emergency leave, I corrected. For immediate family. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Immediate family. The phrase carried weight they hadn't expected to deal with. My father emerged from the kitchen, moving like a man who'd aged a decade in 8 months. His hair had gone completely gray, and his shoulders curved inward as if he were protecting himself from invisible blows. When he saw me, he stopped walking entirely. Sarah, the word came out like a prayer. You came. Of course I came. Quote. We stared at each other across the living room, filled with relatives who'd claimed ownership of this grief, this family, this narrative. He looked like he wanted to hug me, but 6 years of silence had built walls that couldn't be crossed with simple gestures. You look good, he said finally. Military life suits you. Before I could respond, Uncle David intervened. Robert, we need to finalize the arrangements with the funeral home. The service is tomorrow at 2. My father nodded, the moment broken. Business to attend to, logistics to manage. Death, like everything else in this family, required proper planning and appropriate behavior. What can I do to help? I asked. Aunt Patricia exchanged glances with my uncle. Actually, everything's been handled. We've arranged for a lovely service at Sacred Heart, the same church where your parents were married. The burial will be at Riverside Cemetery. Who's speaking? Pastor Williams will deliver the eulogy, and David will share some family memories. I waited for my name to be mentioned, for some role to be assigned to the daughter who'd traveled halfway around the world to be here. The silence extended until the answer became clear. They hadn't planned a place for me in their goodbye. I'd like to speak, I said. Oh, Aunt Patricia's smile was rehearsed, diplomatic. That's sweet, dear, but we've already finalized the program. Besides, you know how your mother felt about public displays. Public displays. Military service reduced to an embarrassing exhibition, something to be hidden from polite company. Marcus stepped forward. Sarah should speak. She's Mom's daughter. Of course she is, Uncle David said quickly, but the service is already planned. Maybe she could read a scripture? A scripture. Something safe, prescribed, impossible to personalize. I looked around the room at these people who'd known my mother for decades, who'd shared holidays and birthdays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners. People who'd earned their right to grieve publicly while I'd been relegated to silent observer. That's fine, I said. Relief washed over their faces. The difficult daughter had been managed, contained within appropriate boundaries. The funeral could proceed according to plan, with no uncomfortable reminders of the choices that had fractured this family. But as evening fell and relatives began departing for their hotels, my father lingered in the kitchen. Marcus was in his old room, making phone calls to coordinate work schedules around the funeral. The house grew quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic. She kept a photo, my father said suddenly, in her jewelry box. You in your dress blues from West Point graduation. I turned from where I'd been washing casserole dishes. Marcus sent it to her? No, she found it online. The academy posts photos of every graduation ceremony. He dried his hands on a dish towel, movements careful and deliberate. She looked at it sometimes when she thought no one was watching, but she never called. Pride. He said the word like it tasted bitter. Your mother's greatest strength and her greatest weakness. She couldn't admit she'd been wrong about you without admitting she'd wasted 6 years being wrong. And you? He met my eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. I was a coward. I should have called. Should have fought harder for you. I thought she'd come around eventually. That time would heal the rift. I didn't realize she was making it permanent. The kitchen fell quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Marcus's voice on the phone upstairs. My father looked older than his 62 years, worn down by years of keeping peace at the cost of truth. The will, I said. He flinched. You received it? 3 days ago. Everything to Marcus, nothing to me. That wasn't my decision. His voice was barely above a whisper. She insisted. Said you'd chosen your path and didn't need anything from us. She was right about that. He studied my face, searching for anger or hurt or some emotion he could respond to. But years of military training had taught me to keep my reactions internal, to process feelings privately and respond strategically. Tomorrow will be difficult, he said finally. For who? For all of us. Your mother's friends, the community, they don't know about the estrangement. They'll expect you to be devastated, to need comfort. They'll expect a grieving daughter. I nodded slowly, understanding. Even in death, my mother's reputation needed protecting. The narrative of the perfect family couldn't be disrupted by the reality of what she'd done to her own daughter. I'll behave appropriately, I assured him. He looked relieved and sad at the same time. She did love you, Sarah, in her own way. I know. But love isn't enough when it comes with conditions. Quote, tomorrow, I'd sit in the front pew and listen to eulogies that painted my mother as a devoted family woman. I'd accept condolences from people who'd watched her erase me from family photos. I'd play the role of the grieving daughter while sitting among relatives who'd made me a stranger. But I'd also be measuring the distance between who I'd become and who they'd wanted me to be. And for the first time in years, I'd be grateful for that distance. Sacred Heart Catholic Church hadn't changed since my childhood confirmation. The same stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across worn wooden pews, and the same musty smell of old hymnals and decades of prayers hung in the air. But sitting in the front row wearing dress blues among a sea of black funeral attire, I felt like an intruder in my own family's grief. The sanctuary filled steadily as Denver's social elite arrived to pay their respects. Country club friends, charity committee members, neighbors who'd known my mother as the woman who organized block parties and never missed a PTA meeting. They filed past our pew with practiced expressions of sympathy, their eyes lingering on my uniform with barely concealed curiosity. Margaret spoke of you often, Mrs. Henderson from down the street whispered as she squeezed my hand. She was so proud of your service. I managed a tight smile and nodded appropriately. The lies felt familiar now, comfortable even. My mother had perfected the art of public fiction, and apparently, her friends had helped maintain the illusion that Captain Sarah Mitchell was a beloved daughter who simply lived far away due to military obligations. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that transformed my mother into a saint. He spoke of her devotion to family, her generous spirit, her unwavering faith. He mentioned her pride in her children, both Marcus and me, describing how she'd beam whenever discussing our accomplishments. The congregation murmured approval at appropriate moments, and several elderly women dabbed their eyes with tissues. I sat motionless, studying the ornate crucifix above the altar while listening to this fictional version of my mother's life. The woman being celebrated had never existed, or had existed only in public spaces where appearances mattered more than truth. The real Margaret Mitchell, the one who'd systematically erased her daughter from family history, remained buried beneath layers of social expectations and community reputation. Marcus squeezed my hand when Uncle David rose to share family memories. His stories were carefully curated. Holiday traditions, family vacations, my mother's famous apple pie recipe. He spoke about her devotion to her grandchildren, her volunteer work at the hospital, her ability to make everyone feel welcome in her home. Everyone except me, I thought, but kept my expression neutral. Margaret's greatest joy came from watching her children grow into the people she'd raised them to be, Uncle David concluded. She knew that both Sarah and Marcus would carry forward the values she'd instilled in them. Values like conditional love and strategic silence, I mused. But the congregation responded with knowing nods and gentle applause. They'd been given the story they expected, the narrative that preserved everyone's comfort and my mother's reputation. The burial at Riverside Cemetery was smaller, limited to family and close friends. We stood around the mahogany casket under a gray October sky while Pastor Williams offered final prayers. I watched dirt being thrown onto polished wood and realized I felt nothing resembling grief. Relief, maybe. Closure, certainly. But not the devastating loss that widows and orphans were supposed to experience. Marcus stood beside me, tears streaming down his face as he said goodbye to the only mother he'd ever known. Jennifer held his arm, occasionally glancing at me with expressions I couldn't interpret. Pity? Curiosity? Fear that this family's capacity for cruelty might somehow be contagious? The reception afterward was held at the country club, in the same banquet room where my parents had celebrated their 25th anniversary. Round tables covered in white linens, centerpieces of fall flowers, servers in black uniforms circulating with wine and hors d'oeuvre. I moved through the crowd like a diplomat at a foreign embassy, accepting condolences and deflecting questions about my military service with practiced efficiency. Captain Mitchell? A voice behind me made me turn. An elderly man in an expensive suit extended his hand. Colonel James Patterson, retired. I served with your grandfather in Vietnam. Finally, someone who might have real stories instead of social fiction. Colonel Patterson, it's an honor. Jim spoke about you constantly during those last years, showed everyone pictures from your West Point graduation, your commissioning ceremony. He was incredibly proud. His eyes grew distant. He also mentioned some family complications. I assume today has been challenging. You could say that. He glanced around the reception, taking in the polite conversations and carefully managed emotions. Jim left some things with me before he died. Said if anything ever happened to your family situation, I should make sure you received them. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow. I'm staying at the Brown Palace until Wednesday. My pulse quickened. More pieces of my grandfather's legacy, hidden away like classified documents until the right security clearance was obtained. I'd appreciate that, sir. He handed me a business card with only his name and a phone number. Call me. There are things about your family's finances that you should understand. Before I could ask what he meant, Aunt Patricia appeared with a group of her bridge club friends, all eager to meet Margaret's daughter, the soldier. I spent the next hour being displayed like a trophy, evidence of the family's patriotic values and diverse achievements. They asked sanitized questions about military life, carefully avoiding topics like combat or deployment separation that might disturb their comfortable worldview. By evening, the relatives had departed for their hotels, leaving just Marcus, Jennifer, my father, and me in the house that felt too large without my mother's controlling presence. We sat in the living room, exhausted by grief and public presentations, finally able to drop our masks. She would have hated that eulogy, Marcus said suddenly. All that stuff about being welcoming and inclusive, Mom was neither of those things. Jennifer shot him a warning look, but he continued. What? We're family. We can tell the truth here. He looked at me. She spent 6 years pretending you didn't exist, then died surrounded by people who thought she was Mother of the Year. It's insane. Marcus, my father said quietly, she did her best. Her best was conditional love and emotional manipulation. My brother's voice carried years of suppressed frustration. Do you know what it was like growing up as the good child? Having to be perfect because Sarah wasn't allowed to be anything? I studied his face, seeing anger I'd never recognized before. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? That I hated being the favorite? That I missed my sister and thought our parents were being cruel? He rubbed his eyes. I was a kid. I thought if I stayed quiet, eventually they'd forgive you and bring you back. Instead, they just got more comfortable with your absence. The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock that had marked time during my childhood arguments and teenage rebellions. My father stared at his hands, perhaps realizing that both his children had been damaged by my mother's ultimatums. "There's something else," I said, pulling out Colonel Patterson's business card. "Someone who served with Grandpa wants to meet with me, about family finances." My father's head snapped up. Jim's estate was settled years ago. Was it? The will mentioned assets quote, in Mom's estate. That suggests there might be assets held elsewhere. "Your grandfather set up some kind of trust," Jennifer said unexpectedly. We all turned to her, surprised. She flushed under our attention. "I helped Marcus research estate law when your mother got sick. There were references to military survivor benefits that couldn't be touched during her lifetime." Marcus nodded. "We found paperwork on Dad's desk, something about a trust fund established in 1987, the year Grandpa retired. But the documents were incomplete, like pages were missing." I looked at my father, who'd gone pale. "You knew about this." "Your grandfather insisted on making provisions," he admitted slowly. "Your mother was furious. She said if you wanted his money, you could have it after she was gone. She made me promise not to tell you until then." The manipulation ran deeper than I'd realized. My mother hadn't just disinherited me from her own estate. She'd actively concealed assets that were already mine. She'd used my grandfather's legacy as a weapon, ensuring that even his love for me couldn't reach me while she was alive. "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "I don't know exactly. Jim handled it through military attorneys, set up trusts, and investment accounts I never fully understood." My father looked older with each word. But it was substantial. 30 years of careful investing, plus death benefits from multiple deployments. The room spun slightly. I had spent 6 years believing my family had rejected me completely, living on military pay and combat bonuses, never knowing that my grandfather had ensured I'd be financially secure. The money itself didn't matter. I'd learned to live without luxury. But the knowledge that he'd fought for me even after death, that my mother had actively prevented me from accessing his love made tangible, felt like a betrayal that went beyond simple disinheritance. "She kept it from me for 6 years, I said. "She kept it from all of us," Marcus corrected. "This family specialized in secrets." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar neighborhood where nothing had changed except my understanding of the people who'd shaped me. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Colonel Patterson and learn the full extent of my grandfather's provisions. I'd discover what legacy he'd actually left me, beyond the lessons about duty and service that had already transformed my life. But tonight, I finally understood the true cost of my mother's conditional love. She hadn't just rejected the daughter I'd become, she'd actively sabotaged the grandfather's support that might have made that rejection less devastating. She'd weaponized grief, inheritance, and family loyalty to maintain control even from the grave. The girl who'd once begged for acceptance was truly gone now, replaced by a woman who finally understood that some people's love wasn't worth having. The Brown Palace Hotel lobby felt like stepping into a different century. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings and leather armchairs clustered around marble tables, where Denver's elite conducted business over whiskey and handshakes. I'd arrived 15 minutes early, using the time to study the other guests and locate all exits. Habits formed in war zones that never quite fade, even in 5-star hotels. Colonel Patterson emerged from the elevator at exactly 1,000 hours, moving with the measured precision of a career officer. He wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored by someone who understood military posture, and his eyes swept the lobby with the same tactical awareness I'd developed overseas. When he spotted me, his expression shifted from professional assessment to something warmer. "Captain Mitchell, thank you for meeting me." We shook hands, his grip firm but not competitive, and he gestured toward a quiet corner where 2 wingback chairs faced each other across a small table. A briefcase sat beside his chair, old leather worn smooth by decades of use. "I took the liberty of ordering coffee," he said as we settled. "I hope that's acceptable." "Of course, sir." Quote. The waitress appeared with a silver service, pouring steaming coffee into delicate china cups that seemed absurdly fragile after months of drinking from metal canteen cups. Colonel Patterson waited until she departed, before opening his briefcase and removing a manila folder thick with documents. "Your grandfather was one of the finest officers I ever served with," he began, his voice carrying the weight of shared memory. "Brilliant tactician, natural leader, absolute integrity. But more than that, he understood something most people never learn: the difference between legacy and inheritance." He opened the folder, revealing pages of legal documents, bank statements, and investment portfolios. Numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. James established the Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell Trust in 1987, immediately following his retirement. Initial funding of $400,000 from his pension lump sum, plus additional contributions from speaking fees, consulting work, and careful investments. Colonel Patterson's finger traced down a column of figures. Current value, as of last month, is $2.3 million. The number hung in the air like ordnance waiting to detonate. $2.3 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to buy a house, start a business, secure a future that didn't depend on military pay and combat bonuses. The trust was structured to remain inaccessible until one of three conditions was met, he continued. Your 25th birthday, your completion of military service, or the death of your mother. Jim was very specific about that last condition. He knew she'd try to control it. He knew Margaret better than she knew herself. James fought in 3 wars, Captain. He understood strategy, including family warfare. Colonel Patterson sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Your mother spent years trying to contest the trust, claiming you'd been manipulated into military service and were therefore not competent to inherit. She hired expensive lawyers, filed multiple appeals, even attempted to have you declared mentally unstable due to combat deployment stress. Rage built in my chest like pressure in a faulty boiler. While I'd been dodging IEDs in Afghanistan, my mother had been in Denver courtrooms trying to steal my grandfather's legacy. While I'd been leading soldiers through hostile territory, she'd been painting me as unfit to manage my own inheritance. None of her challenges succeeded, he assured me quickly. James had structured the trust too carefully, used military lawyers who understood how to protect assets from family interference. But the legal battles delayed access to the funds and required expensive defense. He pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of a major investment firm. The trust also includes a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and real estate investments. There's a cabin in Montana that James bought in 1992, plus a small office building in Colorado Springs that generates rental income. My mind struggled to process the information. I'd been living in base housing and shopping at the commissary while unknowingly owning investment properties. I'd been counting every dollar while sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. Why didn't he tell me? Because he understood your character. James knew that if you were aware of the trust, you might make decisions based on financial security rather than personal conviction. He wanted you to choose military service because you believed in it, not because money was waiting at the end. The wisdom of that decision settled over me like recognition. My grandfather had given me something more valuable than immediate wealth. The knowledge that every choice I'd made had been authentic. West Point, my commissioning, my deployments, all of it had been driven by genuine calling rather than calculated inheritance strategy. There's more, Colonel Patterson said, reaching deeper into the folder. James also established educational funds for your future children, charitable giving accounts for causes you might support, and a separate trust for Marcus. Marcus? Your grandfather loved both his grandchildren, but he recognized that Marcus would follow a conventional path with family support. You were the one who'd need resources to build an independent life. He handed me a sealed envelope. He wrote this for you to receive when the trust became available. The envelope was heavy paper, military stationery with my grandfather's embossed initials. My name was written across the front in his careful script, and the back was sealed with red wax bearing his personal signet ring. I broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded 3 pages of handwritten text. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this letter, then 3 things have occurred. You've reached adulthood, you've survived whatever military service you chose, and your grandmother has passed away. I pray that her death brought peace to a family that forgot how to forgive, but I suspect the damage may be too deep for simple mourning to heal. By now, Colonel Patterson has explained the financial provisions I've made for your future. The money is important, but it's not the real inheritance I'm leaving you. The real inheritance is the knowledge that someone believed in you completely, without conditions or expectations. That someone understood the person you were becoming and wanted to ensure you had the resources to become her fully. Your parents love you, but they love the idea of you more than the reality of you. They want a daughter who reflects their values, validates their choices, makes them feel successful as parents. They cannot love a daughter who challenges their assumptions about what life should look like, what safety means, what legacy truly matters. I've watched you struggle with their conditional approval, seen you trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Stop trying, my dear girl. Some people's love isn't worth having because the price is too high. The price is your authentic self. Use this money to build the life you choose, not the life they choose for you. Travel the world, fight for causes that matter, lead soldiers who depend on your judgment. Make decisions based on what serves the greater good, not what serves family harmony. And remember that the strongest legacies aren't built from inherited wealth, but from earned wisdom. You carry my name, my blood, and my values forward into a world that desperately needs people willing to sacrifice comfort for truth. That's worth more than any dollar amount in any trust fund. With love and respect for the woman you're becoming. Colonel James Mitchell. P.S. The cabin in Montana has a hidden room behind the bookshelf in the main bedroom. Inside, you'll find my war journals, classified documents from operations your history books won't mention, and personal letters from soldiers whose lives I had to risk for missions that mattered. Read them when you're ready to understand the full weight of command. The combination is your West Point graduation date. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier now than they'd been in days. Colonel Patterson watched my face, reading emotions I didn't try to hide. He left me instructions as well, he said quietly. If you chose to remain in the military after accessing the trust, I was to offer you information about opportunities he'd arranged. James maintained connections throughout the defense establishment, Captain. There are positions available to officers with your training and his recommendation that most people never hear about. What kind of positions? Intelligence operations, special assignment programs, liaison positions with agencies that don't advertise their existence. He leaned forward. Your grandfather believed that the most important work happens in the shadows, protecting people who'll never know they needed protection. The offer hung between us like a classified document waiting to be opened. My grandfather had arranged not just financial security, but professional opportunities that could transform my military career into something approaching the legendary service he'd provided. I don't need to decide today, I said. No, but you should know the options exist. He closed the folder and slid it across the table. These are your copies of all trust documents, account information, property deeds, and contact information for the attorneys who manage everything. The Montana cabin keys are in the envelope. I accepted the folder, feeling its weight as more than paper and ink. This was my grandfather's final gift. Not just money, but freedom. Freedom from my family's financial control, from their emotional manipulation, from any need to seek their approval ever again. Thank you, Colonel, for everything. Thank your grandfather, I was just following orders. He stood, extending his hand again. Take care of yourself, Captain. And remember, the best revenge against people who tried to diminish you is becoming exactly who you were meant to be. As I watched him walk away, his words echoed in the hotel lobby like artillery fire. The best revenge was becoming exactly who I was meant to be. I finally had the resources to discover who that was. 2 months after my mother's funeral, I stood in the operations center at Kandahar Airfield, staring at satellite imagery that would determine whether 12 soldiers lived or died. The mission briefing had been classified above my clearance level until Colonel Patterson's connections opened doors I hadn't known existed. Now I was leading a joint intelligence operation that could reshape American strategy in the region. Captain, what's your assessment? Major General Rodriguez leaned over the tactical display, his expression grave. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been a standard infantry officer filing routine reports. Tonight, I was briefing flag officers on terrorist networks that threatened allied governments. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Returning to Afghanistan after my mother's death, I'd found a message waiting in my secure email. Reassignment orders to the Strategic Intelligence Division. Effective immediately. No explanation, just coordinates for a briefing that would change everything. The briefing had been conducted by a woman who introduced herself only as Director Walsh. She wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision, and her questions about my background suggested she knew details about my service that weren't in any official file. Your grandfather recommended you for specialized operations before his death, she'd explained. We've been watching your development, waiting for the right moment to make contact. Apparently, that moment was now. With my family's financial leverage eliminated and my mother's interference permanently ended, I was finally free to pursue the destiny my grandfather had envisioned. The work was unlike anything I'd done before. Instead of leading patrols through hostile villages, I was coordinating with foreign intelligence services, analyzing communication intercepts, and planning operations that would never appear in newspaper headlines. My teams included operators from units that didn't officially exist, specialists whose expertise could shift global power balances. The Montana cabin had become my sanctuary during leave periods. Hidden behind the bookshelf, exactly as my grandfather had described, I'd discovered his war journals, spanning 4 decades of classified operations. Reading them was like receiving tactical training from beyond the grave, learning lessons about leadership, sacrifice, and the moral complexity of protecting freedom. His entries revealed operations in countries the public believed America had never touched, missions that had prevented conflicts most people would never know had been brewing. He'd operated in moral gray areas where perfect solutions didn't exist, where protecting American lives sometimes required compromising American ideals. Command means accepting that every decision carries casualties, he'd written after a particularly difficult operation in Cambodia. The question isn't whether people will die because of your choices, but whether the right people live because of them. Those words guided me through my first major operation as a Strategic Intelligence Division team leader. We'd identified a terrorist cell, planning simultaneous attacks on 3 European capitals. But stopping them required cooperation from intelligence services that didn't trust each other, and politicians who prioritized domestic concerns over international security. The operation took 6 months of careful coordination, with my team serving as the bridge between competing agencies and conflicting national interests. We shared intelligence selectively, orchestrated arrests strategically, and ensured that credit for success was distributed in ways that served larger diplomatic goals. When the terrorist plot was finally disrupted, no American newspapers mentioned our involvement. The victories were claimed by local law enforcement agencies, and the prevented catastrophe became someone else's success story. But 3 major cities remained safe, and thousands of people continued their lives without ever knowing how close they'd come to tragedy. That's when I understood what my grandfather had meant about legacy versus inheritance. The money he'd left me was inheritance, valuable but passive. The real legacy was the opportunity to serve in ways that mattered, even when recognition was impossible. My promotion to major came with assignment to a joint task force operating across 7 countries. The work was classified at levels I'd never imagined, requiring security clearances that took months to process. But it also provided the kind of purpose I'd been seeking since the day I first heard my grandfather's stories about duty and sacrifice. The team I led included operators from Delta Force, intelligence analysts from agencies with acronyms most people had never heard, and liaison officers from allied nations who trusted American judgment more than American politics. Together, we prevented conflicts, eliminated threats, and maintained the delicate balance that kept democratic societies secure. 6 months into the assignment, I received a secure communication from Marcus. He'd finished law school and was working for a firm specializing in veterans' rights. Jennifer was pregnant with their first child, and they decided to name the baby James if it was a boy, after the grandfather who'd taught us both about standing up for what mattered. I've been thinking about what you said at Mom's funeral, he wrote, about some people's love not being worth having. I think you were right, but I also think some people's love is worth everything, even when it comes with impossible choices. His letter arrived during a particularly difficult operation, when my team was facing decisions that would affect civilian populations in ways that couldn't be undone. Reading about his growing family, about the normal life he was building with Sunday dinners and backyard barbecues, I felt a pang of something that might have been envy. But only for a moment. Because the next morning brought intelligence about an imminent attack that only we could prevent, and I remembered why I'd chosen this path. Normal was beautiful for people who could live with it. For those called to something larger, normal was a luxury that cost too much. The mission succeeded, as most of them did, not because we were particularly heroic, but because we were particularly prepared. Years of training, months of planning, and moments of execution that transformed intelligence into action, theory into protection, duty into lives saved. Standing in my quarters that night, I opened my grandfather's final letter once more. His words about building the life I chose, not the life others chose for me, had become prophecy. The money he'd left had purchased independence, but the values he'd instilled had purchased something more valuable: the knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged. My family had tried to erase me from their story, but my grandfather had ensured I could write my own. And the story I was writing, classified though it might be, was one of service, sacrifice, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from protecting people who would never know they'd needed protection. The girl who'd once begged for conditional love was gone forever, replaced by a woman who'd learned that the most important approval comes from looking in the mirror and recognizing someone worthy of respect. Some inheritances are measured in dollars, others are measured in lives saved, threats eliminated, and freedoms preserved. I'd received both, and finally understood which one mattered more. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.